Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Bintani. My name is Matt Kirkegaard from Brews News, and I'm here to host the first session, which is it's billed in the program as the US Hop Cross, but it is the US Hop Masterclass. I think we've got 4 amazing guests to speak to. Now, when I left them 25 minutes ago, when we checked to make sure, they were chatting away happily. So I'm hoping they haven't left all of their A material before the cameras came on. But I'll introduce you to them. The first is Alexandra Noel. Alexandra is a technical advisor with CLS Farms. She's an experienced brewer with a career that has seen her brew at Moylan's, Kinetic, and almost 8 years at Three Weavers Brewing. Over the course of her career, Alexandra has developed a special interest in raw ingredients and the supply chain. And if you'd like to hear more about Alexandra, she recently featured in a podcast called Brewer to Brewer from All About Brewing in the US, where she was interviewed by our own Scotty Hargrave. And it's a great chat talking about a lot that's going on in the world of brewing. Our second guest is Stan Hieronymus, who I'm sure is a name that is very well known. He's the author of many books, including For the Love of Hops. From a beer journalist point of view, he is the beacon of specialist reporting in the brewing industry. And I would highly recommend signing up for his Hop Notes, which is a free newsletter that you can get from his website, Appellation Beer. Our third guest is Jim Solberg from Indie Hops. Indie Hops launched a hop breeding program at Oregon State University in 2009, which grew to include Oregon's first post-farm processing facility and an experimental hop program. And finally, Tom Britt from Glacier Hops Ranch. Glacier Hops Ranch began in 2012 as the first commercial hop yard in Montana. It has since evolved to become a global dealer of premium processed hops. Now, welcome to the 4 of you. Thank you very much for joining us late on Thursday afternoon, I believe.
Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Now,
my pleasure.
With hops, there is so much that we can talk about, but in many ways, brewers and consumers embracing the impact of hops in beer is what sparked the craft beer revolution, and we've seen it evolve rapidly over the last 20 years. As the industry matures, increased competition amongst brewers, the changing economic conditions, and the growing focus on environmental sustainability, the conversations around hops are changing, and I would argue that the conversations are becoming much more sophisticated. So, Stan, I might throw to you to begin with, and just talk. Your Hop Notes has captured some of the huge research changes and the growing research that we've seen in hops, and we've moved from just throwing more hops in for dry hopping for impact in hops to really understand some of the chemistry of hops. Is that a fair place to start?
Understanding and sometimes misunderstanding, but yeah. It's only 20 years ago that a researcher in Japan identified thiols as an important aroma flavor additive. And tying that in, as a matter of fact, to Sauvignon Blanc grapes and the compounds in those. And that kicked off a lot of research, but it took a while, like almost another 10 years before that was looked at seriously. And then the next round is identifying hops where those compounds, thiol compounds, are available. And then a third round, identifying hops where they might be in a bound form. So it's going to take something different to free them. And we're kind of at that point right now. For people down under, the unfortunate thing is the development of modified yeast, which are only available in the United States right now. The people producing those are working on it, getting at least some of them okayed to ship to New Zealand and Australia, and working with those 2 countries together.
And I will encourage the 4 of you, if anyone likes to weigh in on any of the questions, please jump in rather than waiting for a question. Jim?
Were you... Oh, no, I just was changing positions there.
Alexandra is a brewer who has stepped into the hop industry. What are you seeing on farm in terms of the way that farmers are approaching the flavor impact and the aroma impact of hops in the farm, in the hop fields?
So, I mean, obviously we can step that back from the field to what decisions are made into what is actually planted in those fields, right? And that's absolutely driven to a degree by brewer demand, whether that's in the aroma side or the alpha side. So really, it's absolutely following the trends of what's going on and working kind of in tangent with breeders as well to decide what's exciting and what can actually be brought onto the farm and grown there. Aside from that, though, there's been a major play towards looking at new varieties with strong agronomics, so that sustainability is something in addition to sustainability in your brewery, sustainability as a farm operation, but choosing sustainable hop varieties that yield well to the grower themselves. Because when it comes down to it, I mean, as a brewer, we understand our breweries are businesses, but the farms are businesses as well. And we can grow these really amazing hops that smell great and are impactful in beer, but if they're not sustainable at the business level of the farm, they won't survive. Farms themselves won't survive. So I think at CLS personally, we're looking at aroma first, right? We're very quality driven in everything that we're doing on the farm. But when it comes down to what we decide to plant and expand in the future, especially with new varieties, agronomics are definitely taking a really huge focus on our decision making.
I could add something to the agronomics piece. Talked to a lot of farms, and it's a combination of things. So what's your yield of a desirable profile, of a sensory profile, tending to be aroma hops more so than alpha hops. But what's the resistance to mildews, downy mildew, powdery mildew, or other bugs in other parts of like down in Southwest Idaho, for instance? And they're susceptible to a different parasitic grub. And how easy are they to harvest? Some of these get really thick, woody binds, and how easy is the hop to dry? There's a number of combinations that add to it that are less obvious. They're real obvious to a farmer who's battling with it and breaking down machines because of this or that, or having to have a regular spray program. But the agronomics, you're absolutely right. That is a huge part of it that the farmer looks at.
Jim, you're involved in a lot of research. What are you seeing in the research stage of the hop evolution?
Yeah, I guess just to continue on what Tom was saying there, we'll look out even a little bit further on the issues around climate change. In the program, some of the research and the breeding efforts, for example, there's an effort to develop some drought-resistant varieties. Another issue that has been hitting the main growing regions in the U.S. anyway, more and more, is warmer winters. You can have a case of warmer winters where you don't get enough winter chill for the hop plant. It gets confused, doesn't know when to wake up and start growing at the right time in the spring. These are all wonderful things that can be addressed in hop breeding, that sort of a thing. Priority number one is hop varieties that have incredible brewing characteristics that are going to, express themselves in beer in a way that helps brewers to brew great beers and excite the consumers. But at the same time, there's a lot more focus now on agronomy, disease resistance, sustainability, better yields, just a more stable crop that has some long-term potential.
I want to piggyback on that, if I may. I had the opportunity to join a group at the German Hop Institute right before Drink Tech in September, right as they were going on at harvest, and had quite a dialogue with Walter Koenig, who runs the German Hop Institute there, and the efforts that they are going through and have been going through to develop drought-resistant, heat-resistant varieties. Last year was one of those years where they needed to irrigate, but I think that's happened twice in the last 5 years that I can think of. But they were not able to irrigate. The German government wouldn't let them irrigate. So I think the number in Germany is 16 to 20% of the farms there have irrigation, but even if they had it, they weren't allowed to. I know that because we had a manager in in Prague, and the Czech government was concerned that some of the Czech farmers weren't going to make it because it was so bad last year. Same thing on irrigation. They've got 60%, I think, is the number that have irrigation couldn't use it. But the German Hop Institute has been tracking climate for 30 years, and they showed us in black and white, at least in their part of the world, that it's very real. And so they're trying to take some of these 40, 50-year-old varieties that we take for granted, Hallertau, Mittelfrüh, et cetera, and developing varieties that have better agronomic characteristics.
I think that was the clearest, easiest thing to visualize, is to realize that 2 years ago in 2021, the Czechs had their best Saaz harvest in 25 years.
Right. Yeah, they did.
They had their worst harvest in 26 years, half of what they got in 2021.
So what is that, Stan? If your head's in the furnace and your feet's in the freezer, on average, you feel pretty good?
Yeah. And it's tricky because their researchers are developing varieties that are more drought resistant, that do better in the heat. But so far, the growers have not moved to those. And you got to suspect part of that is because brewers are not moving to those as well. The brewers also have to embrace these better agronomics as well.
Completely
agree. You
agree.
can grow whatever you want, but if no one wants to brew with it, then
yep.
I'm going to sit on them for a very long time.
And I imagine that's one of the great challenges, maybe throw this one to Jim to kick this off, is a lot of the hops that have come on and been launched in the last 2 or 3 years have had a 12, 13, 14, 15-year development phase. And the issues that brewers are confronting now are different than the ones that were kicking off when those hops would have been first crossed. What are the conversations now around the agronomics versus the flavour impact in beers?
Well, I mean, for us, like I mentioned earlier, the brewing character, the flavor and aroma contribution is the first hurdle that you have to, that's a box you have to check. And, so when we started the program in 2009, that was the goal. I mean, that wasn't terribly long ago, but at the time, most of the folks here would remember, really all hop breeding was focused on alpha, and even the smash hit flavor hops that came out of that, like Citra, they were bred for alpha, and they came out and eventually were found to be useful in a different way, extremely useful. And so, we figured that eventually the craft industry would expand, and there would be a lot more breweries, and you would need more unique flavors. There'd be a greater need for differentiation for breweries of flavors. And so, we were looking for unique flavor profiles from the beginning. And so that never really changed. The challenge is when we started, our first big launch was Strata, which has been very successful, but it only had 1 year in the market before the pandemic hit. And, all these challenges for the brewing industry started hitting. It powered through that fairly well, but, we're still, the entire industry is still kind of grinding around trying to find, where things are going and get things balanced again. So yeah, I think what's become the bigger challenge for us is managing supply, really kind of being able to, along with breweries, try to figure out where things are going.
Alexandra, you raise the issue of you can grow anything that you want, but brewers need to want to use it. I guess ultimately that passes downstream to the consumer. The consumers need to want to buy it for the brewers to make it. How do we steer the market so brewers can be mindful about the ingredients that they use?
Well, okay, when it comes down to it, you can't drink a beer unless it's been produced for you, right? Yep. So to a degree, it is our job as brewers to provide something that the consumer wants. I don't think that if someone woke up in the morning and they said, I really want to drink a hazy IPA, let's make this like the biggest winning thing since like the standard West Coast IPA. it was brewed that way. It was intentionally produced by a brewer and presented to a consumer, and it caught on that way. So really, it starts with the brewer in the brewery. And when it comes to new hop varieties, a lot of times these newer varieties, it takes one or two larger breweries to put it into like one of their year-round beers, and that can create a massive amount of success around a variety. Strata specifically, I mean, as a brewer, it's been around for quite some time. That's one of the more unique proprietary hops that I had come across in a long time. And I think, that hop has been so successful because it's provided something different to the brewer that we've then brought down to the consumer, who now understands what Strata is. But, there's, I guess, looking at American culture and what Americans drink as beer, and the fact that, now most Americans understand what a craft beer is or what a hazy IPA is. We've always been kind of inclined towards the sweeter things, fruitier things. And so I think that's why hop breeding has gone in this very tropical, fruit-forward direction. Sure, as brewers, we're kind of like perpetuating this concept of what they want. But if you want to talk about like how to appeal to the consumer, it's not the consumer, it's out of the brewery. So it's up to the brewer to decide what they want, put it in a recipe, and present it in the right package to the consumer.
Stan, I saw you nodding there. Was there something you wanted to add?
It's funny, 10, 12 years ago, talking to Tony Lutz, who's the hop breeder in Germany, who said at the time, his job is to look that far forward, have all these things to choose from. And when a brewer comes in and says, I want this flavor, he can say, yes, I have this right here. But the other change is how broad, how much of that is going to end up planted. And Jim and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, as a matter of fact. Do we get to the point that do you have to have a home run? There's not going to be another Citra. There's not going to be another hop that goes to that many acres. But do you need it for it to be 100 acres, 200 acres, 500 acres? I think that's the challenge, is how many you can get out there. And then to Alex is, how many different hops can you grow and take good care of?
I mean, a lot, I think. Do you want to talk? CLS has 26 varieties on the farm right now, obviously
right.
Varying sizes of acreage, right? The bread and butter of CLS is Eldorado and Centennial, but we are growing a lot of small plots of other things. We actually had one brewer save Triumph on our farm. It's a public variety out of Oregon that there's been a little bit grown in Washington. It's kind of fallen out of favor in a lot of ways, but we had this one brewery that just was like a year after year, we select CLS Triumph, and the key was for them to just write a small contract, and we kept it in the ground, and we grew 3 acres of Triumph on one of our farms just for this brewer. And so you don't necessarily need a lot of acreage in the ground. Is that a long-term play? Absolutely not.
Well, you need a contract.
Yes, you need a contract.
Well, and that's been that's been an issue in the last, I say, 3-4 years, where contracting was the lifeblood of farms, and knowing what to plant, knowing what they could count on, and with this excess supply that has grown, it's so easy to buy whatever you want on the spot market. I think statistically, the last 2 years, Brewers Association reports shows that they're in the mid 40s in terms of the number of growers that contract. And that's not a sustainable model, which goes back to this supply issue, Jim, that you mentioned, in terms of, and kind of touching on the whole notion of reducing acreage in the U.S. Hop industry, which was pretty much announced at the Hop Convention last month in California, about a reduction of 10,000 acres across the board, and who can enforce that, who can control it, what varieties is going to be. They're trying, and nobody can enforce it, but everybody sees that it's a problem. And nobody's going to know what the end result is going to be until maybe 4 months from now, when they give the stringing reports. And so, will it come down?
It comes down to more calculated risk, right? And I think the calculated risk in American farms now is to remove some of the aroma hops from the ground that we all love and plant more alpha. And that's certainly the approach that we're taking, instead of idling all acreage that doesn't need to be planted at CLS. We're definitely moving towards more alpha hops than we've planted in a long time.
Stan,
It's going to be really interesting
Sorry,
to
Tom.
see how it all shakes out. The proprietaries and versus the public varieties, alpha versus aroma. I think you're going to see a lot of aroma coming out of the market or coming out of the ground, like you said. We've talked about a lot of different things that are impacting the growers, and all I can say is there's going to be a pretty dramatic shift from everybody that I talked to at the convention and what I'm hearing since then.
Well, I'd say Jim can address this specifically because he is a proprietary hop owner with Strata, and talk about what you're doing, which I think from the other people I've talked to, it's pretty typical.
Yeah, it's a case where and it was hard to foresee some of the things that happened with the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the inflationary pressures, the strengthening U.S. dollar, and the impact that has on exported USA grown hops, et cetera. So, long story short, I mean, the market, we're lucky that we launched Strata and it's very successful. It's relatively new. It's still a growth hop, but it's not going to grow as fast as we thought during this rough patch, basically. And so, yeah, you get into a case like that, and there's just no way around cutting way back. We call it idling some acreage, and so we're not going to take it out of the ground because in the long run, the demand we feel is going to be there. But we work with the growers and we say, hey, we're overshot. We have to idle, 30% or so of the acreage, and they'll take care of it still. We'll compensate them for, watering the plants and keeping them free of mildew, sort of a thing. And so the farm's okay. There's some lost opportunity, but for us, I mean, the deal is you just don't want to be stuck with a mountain of hops out there. And as we're trying to figure out where the market's going and when it loosens up, I mean, we're doing that. But at the same time, we just launched our newest hop from the 2022 crop called Luminosa. You come out of the blocks, there are 0 contracts. We were pretty confident that it was going to be a well-received hop. And so, we went out fairly aggressively with about 40 acres or so. And it's been very well received. So there's one, some people came in and immediately wanted a contract, not enough to necessarily say, hey, let's expand it dramatically. But we can clearly see that it's a growth hop. It makes sense to put in some more acreage. And so that is one we'll propagate. We're doing that now. We'll put in some acreage. There's going to be demand for its unique characteristics. So you still have that going. There's a need for certain unique flavors in the marketplace. But at the same time, the old standbys, the Citra, Mosaic, Simcoes, they reached their peak and they're awesome hops, but they're going to settle down to a much lower number than where they are right now. They're still going to be huge. They're still going to be great for the industry, but yeah, it's challenging right now, and you need to bring it into balance.
We're kind of at the opposite end of that spectrum with our new variety that we launched here in Montana called Aroma. And, it came out of my research hop yard. I couldn't get anybody to really grow it that could process it properly. And finally, a couple of years ago, we found a grower that had the infrastructure to do it. It's doing really well. Agronomically, it's fantastic. This last year was the first year we've had it in pellets. So we're just testing the market demand, and then we're assessing what's the reaction. We've got, collabs going all over the place, positive results. But the issue that I'm looking at is how to pace adding more acreage, knowing that I've got to, like your German friend, look 2 years in the future to try to figure out what kind of acreage we're going to add to that. So, it's very much like keeping our ear to the ground, and we can't see the buffalo, but we can sure hear them coming.
Stan, the issue of oversupply seems to have exploded, into the consciousness of the brewing industry. As a long-time observer of the industry, what has contributed to that? Has it been hops were overplanted for market growth that hasn't come, or has the usage of hops and the demand for hops in brewing receded?
Well, I'll answer the usage one first,
Yeah.
simply because the Brews Association tracks usage. And if you look at the number that they'll show hop usage, that's the pellets going down just a tiny bit. But of course, it's about 1.5 times what it was 6-7 years ago. However, their calculation is more difficult because we have so many advanced products that Bart Watson, looking at that, thinks overall the raw hop that goes into that is probably going up per barrel being produced. And I think it was at the hop convention. But he's given 2 presentations recently. I saw the hop convention and then to association members last week, thinking you're going to get ongoing from the craft industry single-digit growth in hop usage. The problem was that didn't happen in the last couple of years. And then meanwhile, planning was overly optimistic. So Alex Barth's estimate is there are probably 35 to 40 million pounds excess that need to be worked out. And you've got a capacity, depending upon what happens, and the difference between 21 and 22 was simply a bad crop, but you ended up with 12 million pounds less. So the reduction to get to 40 million to take 4 years means you have to produce 10 million pounds less per year. So dropping back to 50,000 acres, getting sort of average yields would get you to that number. So the excess, of course, came from the pandemic, was certainly a factor. It's been a factor. Jim and I talked about this again. Overseas shipping to Europe just totally collapsed. Part of that is the exchange rate. Part of it is the pandemic there as well. Part of that was the shipping cost. So all these things were harder to estimate. And the market has not reacted to price as well either. So talking to a couple dealers who were saying, you know, in the last 6 months or so it took a while, that brewers are turning to more often asking for hops that are less expensive, which often means the public hops. And some of those varieties, which maybe should have been priced lower, didn't react as well. And an example would be Amarillo, which has gone through its rough period. But certainly Darren did a better job of reacting to what was going on in the market and pricing his hop. And I would say the same thing happened with El Dorado at CLS. It's more market sensitive.
Does anybody want
We're
to
hearing a lot of those same things, Stan, in terms of the price sensitivity on international hops. I mean, on shipping internationally, there's definitely and this is an opportunity that we're hearing for new varieties that can be priced in between where some of those proprietaries are and where the public varieties are. They're trying to get their costs in line.
Mm-hmm. And if we go back to your question about research and what's going on, as people begin to understand the compounds within the hops, they can find those compounds in a combination of hop varieties and put them together in brewing. In some ways, it helps. Certainly, this is brewers and growers working to understand where the brewers can tell the growers what they want, and the growers can tell the brewers, maybe I can do this.
Tom, looking at some of the market drivers for hops, when I look at the marketing materials for hop soil, it's almost a case study in the things that are driving a lot of the market. If I think back 15, 20 years ago, when the IBU wars were taking place in the brewing industry, brewers almost reveled in the inefficient use of hops as a selling mechanism for beer. Where, you know, with cost pressures, the changing economy, and also changing drinking styles, it's things like cost, efficiency, consistency, balance are the words that brewers, and that seems to be the hop soil marketing materials tick all of those boxes.
Well, that wasn't how we started. And When I first got exposed to getting a fresh hop, a wet hop, steam distilled hop oil, I was blown away by by what it did to a beer, and I thought that it was the sensory that was the hot button. And after working, I launched that back in 2016, and boy, was I wrong. And so brewers who started using it, the biggest thing that we did to develop those materials that you're talking about is we just shut up and listened to what the brewers told us. They told us about how they were, their average yield was increasing with the use of this, and they were, we really came into a messaging of efficiency, the economics, the reversing the yield loss. Everybody talks about the more hops you use, the more beer you lose. And we can find out that, or we learn that for every 400 grams of hop pellets you use per hectoliter, you're losing about 6.5 to 7.5% of your yield. And so if they're using a kilogram, boom, you're in the 15 to 20% yield loss. And if we can recover that, now it's an economic conversation. And it's funny because I've been telling my people internally here that inflation is our friend, because this is one, I guess, ingredient from a cost perspective that can reverse or counteract the inflationary issues. Another thing, when I started out with that, this is a real typical brewer that I would talk to. We're traditional brewers, and we only use hop pellets or whole leaf or something like that. And brewers were very resistant to extracts. Going back to Bart Watson's presentation, Stan, that you were referring to, the thing that stood out to me is the change in format that has become accepted and the reason why. What shocked me was that I think it was 85% of all the hop equivalent pounds used in the U.S. Was hop pellets. I didn't realize it was that low. I thought it was over 90%. But he only started asking this question in 2021, so he's only got 2 years worth of history on this. But the other downstream products that he measured, interesting, he included whole leaf as one of those options, powders like cryo as one of those, and then all categories of oils in that. And from 21 to 22, the powders was about the same, 7.4, 7.5%. The whole leaf declined from, let's say, 4% to 2%. But what jumped out at me was that the oils went from 3.2% of all the equivalent pounds used by association members responding to the survey to 11.9%. And hop pellet, I think it went down to 76% or something like that. But it just shocked me that it was about a 3.5-fold increase in the use of all kinds of oils. And there are many, many kinds of hop oils out there. But he furthered that in the collab hour that you were talking about, Stan, yesterday. And he mentioned that it was efficiency. It's being driven by efficiency. And when you look at the average craft brewer using about, it's kind of held steady at about 1.5 pounds per barrel in imperial measurements for the last 5 or 6 years. And you compare that to industrial usage at about 1/10 of that. It's a serious problem, and anything that brewers can do to be more efficient. That's why those boxes are checked in all our marketing materials.
Does anybody want to add to that and talk about Alexandra, as a brewer, you'd remember the great debates about what was craft beer, and traditional was a big element, and it was old-fashioned brewing. There has been a significant change in the discussion around the use of hop extracts and hop products.
I've never been resistant to the idea of using them. I like to say I was born and bred as a California brewer, spent my entire career brewing IPAs. So it was all about how to make a hoppier beer, not necessarily a bitter beer, a hoppier beer. I come from a school of lower bitterness IPAs, pre-hazy, but the kind of newer style West Coast IPAs. But I still remember, it wasn't that long ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago, when cryo was being piloted as just a powder, right? And it hadn't been pelletized yet. and you have Yakima Chief kind of knocking on your door saying, hey, we have this new product. It's a concentrated, more than a T45 concentrated powder of lupulin. We'd love for you to use this. And we threw it into the whirlpool. We threw it into a fermenter for a dry hop. Well, it floated on top of both things. It was impossible to homogenize into the wort and into the beer. And we're like, well, this is great. This is fantastic. This isn't going to work. I think a lot of people gave them that same feedback because they pelletized everything shortly after to use a little bit of weight. But I've really loved seeing, one, because I've mostly worked for small breweries, yield is amazing to see. But first of all, it's aromatic impact to me. So when I'm able to see really concentrated aroma, and also when you're processing hops into different forms, you're kind of leaving out some of the lesser desirable characteristics that you might not want. Obviously, you need some of the plant matter. Polyphenols are important in a beer. However, stripping some of those things out, you were able to get these more concentrated characteristics. And so that's what always really excited me about advanced products of all kinds. You now have more of the liquid additions, and you have some brewers playing around with terpene additions, and which can be a little over the top. But whatever you could provide to me as kind of like a palate as a brewer, I was always on board for all of that. And so it doesn't surprise me to see that it's been adopted so readily. Obviously, the yield increase is pretty great when you're a large brewery. 2 to 3% really quantifies itself quickly, but that was never necessarily my focus.
Jim, the access that brewers have to new ingredients and new techniques and a better understanding of the product that Alexandra alluded to seems to be coinciding with a consumer trend towards drinkability and a change in the approach that they're looking for in craft beers. Are you seeing that in the US?
Yeah, no, I think they do use that term drinkability a lot now, and I feel like we're seeing that. Craft brewing here had a ton of success in aggressively hopped beers, and those aren't going away. I mean, that's a particular consumer, and they love their heavily hopped beers, and they drink a lot of them, and it really was a great driver of the craft industry and the hop industry, frankly. But yeah, I think that there's a broader audience out there that we're kind of getting tuned into. I mean, the hazy thing, like was mentioned earlier, it just proved what, other industries already knew. People like smoother, less bitter flavors in a lot of beverages, and that proved true in beer. There are a lot of people who prefer that, and it's great because it's kind of opened up a whole nother spectrum of potential consumers for beer, especially in craft. So yeah, no, I think that's happening. I think there's more interest in lower alcohol beers that are flavorful. That's not necessarily. I think it's an additional thing, and so that does still help. I mean, the hop industry loves to see 4 pounds per barrel going into IPAs kind of a thing. But I think for the industry overall, it's super healthy to have some lower alcohol options that are flavorful and unique to craft. So it's really nice to see that. I think, we kind of focus on hop varieties and having kind of smoother characteristics, bright, fresh flavors, but smooth, accessible to a wide range of consumer palates. And so, that and just, on the downstream products, I mean, it has been great to see all the options that are out there. I mean, it's kind of difficult to navigate. I mean, there's so many different downstream products now. They all kind of have their place, but it's fun for brewers to figure out where they help. We kind of like to start with, the T90 pellet. We jokingly refer to it as a T99 pellet because it has over 99% of the natural hop cone, and we kind of like to start there because with new varieties, it does express the full spectrum of natural flavors that come from a new hop variety. And so it's kind of nice to get started there, get that established. But then, our neighbors at Crosby Hops have developed another cryogenic lupulin pellet called CGX. And so we've worked with them to go ahead and make Strata available in a cryogenic form, in a concentrated pellet, which I think is great, combined with those T90 pellets as a platform to come in and, punch up character a little bit and gain some efficiencies. I mean, why not? It works nicely. So yeah, the drinkability thing I think is good for craft. Thank God the bitterness wars are gone. And
when we talk about drinkability, though, I think you should remember, again, we'll invoke Bart Watson's name, where he's looking at IPAs and hazy IPAs. The growth in the IPAs and hazy IPAs have higher alcohol, as a matter of fact. Alcohol's a good carrier for flavor. That's part of it, flavor and aroma. And maybe, unfortunately, I don't think anybody's proven this, but when consumers look at what they're getting, they like the idea they're getting more alcohol for their buck. So interest in higher alcohol beers is not going away.
Well, I guess that's one of the things that's always differentiated the Australian and the US markets. Our tax regime punishes higher alcohol, and consequently, our industry, and I would argue that Australian brewers are some of the most innovative when it comes to lower alcohol but flavoured beers. It sets them in good stead for some of these trends that we're talking about. Does anyone have any observation on that, the way that cost pressure may have driven the use of hops?
Or lack of pressure, you mean? They say that's what sets the U.S. apart from many other countries, because you don't have higher taxes for higher amounts of alcohol, and plus we're just generally drunks.
I think where you've seen more of the pressure to reduce hop use is through for any brewery that's packaging, and most breweries throughout COVID had to start packaging. The increase in your materials on the package side, aluminum, paperboard, plastics, really malt in addition to that. Remember, we all used malt in our beer. We had a terrible U.S. crop, and malt has skyrocketed. Everything has really increased in cost, and it's outpaced inflation in a lot of ways. And so, you have a brewer that has to make a decision. You have to put the beer into a can, which usually has to go into a carton of some kind. But you can use a couple of pounds per barrel of hop. Well, not per barrel, but like in general, you can cut your hop use a little bit, and it's not necessarily a perceptible change, but the packaging is kind of an unavoidable part of it. And so at least at Three Weavers, fortunately, we didn't have to really make a ton of decisions in terms of cutting recipes, but the squeeze on the cost of everything else, it hurts for sure.
The last topic I wanted to throw to the panel before we went to the floor for some questions is the issue of sustainability. We've touched on it briefly in a number of ways, but as consumers become much more aware of sustainability and carbon footprints for industries, what are some of the innovations that we're seeing in hops specifically? Maybe start with Jim.
Yeah, I think, Alex touched on some of it earlier. One of the great ways to improve, reduce the carbon footprint of a hop yard is to have higher yields. So new varieties that can have a higher yield per acre, assuming the chemical inputs to that acre are the same, you're definitely improving. One thing we do, we're based in Oregon, and so it's a somewhat unique growing environment, and we're a little better positioned to focus on earlier harvest dates. That's another big help. We can have a strat as one of those that is an early hop, and so it's in a month before they're starting to crank away on Mosaic, for example, and you have a whole month. And it's during that month of the most disease-ridden time in the hop growing process of mildews, et cetera, mites, and so it's great. You miss that whole month. You can have your hop in. It's healthy, disease resistance, pest resistance. Those things contribute tremendously because, again, the farm can reduce their chemical inputs and what they're having to do to protect those plants. And so, those are the main areas of focus on from a sustainability standpoint. I think consistency of the character plays to that as well, because if you can, the more accurately you can be, producing, if you're not overproducing, that helps a ton. I mean, if you're having to overproduce and end up composting, a significant percentage of hops, that's working in the wrong direction, right? And so if you can be consistent with the character, consistent with the performance, some varieties are all over the board, and it is so hard to take a variety that is going to be 2,500 pounds per acre this year and then 500 pounds per acre next year. It is almost impossible to manage that. So focusing on those areas is really the main area that we look at with respect to sustainability.
Chemical inputs, right? Sorry, chemical inputs are really the single largest cost behind labor on our farm. And when it comes down to it, you reduce that. That's great. But, another thing that we've done is how to remedy old hopland too, through cover cropping and taking care of the soil itself so that there are less inputs that have to go in because the ground itself is in a healthier and more sustainable place for the crop. I mean, we're farming on land that's had hops on it for 100 years, and you're going to strip the land of everything that's inside of that soil. And so taking an approach throughout the non-growing seasons and what we choose to plant and how we choose to rotate these cover crops through our field has had a huge input on, one, the quality of the hop coming out of the ground, but two, how we actually have to intervene with it throughout the growing season.
One thing I'd like to add is that a year ago, January, the Hop Growers of America, they shared with us the first life cycle assessment, greenhouse gas emissions and carbon in the whole production cycle of growing hops. And there were a few things that in that presentation that I thought were kind of eye-opening. Some of them, I guess, in hindsight, make perfect logic. But in the whole, from planting and the emerging from the ground all the way to harvest and processing, pelleting, packaging, that whole range, 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions came from the growing, harvesting, and kiln drying of the whole leaf hops. About 8% in the pelletizing and packaging, and 2% were just kind of blown off in other losses. But not surprisingly, the biggest single source of greenhouse gas emissions were from kiln drying of the hops. That kind of made me open up my eyes and say, well, wait a minute, with our hop soil, we're bypassing that whole step. And what does that mean? So we had to do a deep dive to find out, well, how does that compare with our steam distilled hop where we're doing that? So we ran the analysis of that. And what we found is that because of that, now we still have to run a steam boiler with natural gas and to create the steam to do that. So it's not 100% offset. But when we did compare side by side, we found out that the production of hop soil, the greenhouse gas emissions was almost 47% less. Now, the question, so we found that that's a fact. Where does that message, where does that play well? It plays really well in Europe. They're very, very conscious of it. I don't find that message plays as well here in the States. I don't know how that message plays in Australia, but I'm finding that there are some areas where they will talk the talk, but they won't walk the walk. And I've talked to one large, I can't remember who it was, and if I did remember, I couldn't tell you or wouldn't tell you anyway. But it was one of the big five beer companies, and the fellow mentioned, we've got our sustainability, we're going to get to net zero by 2030. And he shook his head and he said, we have no idea how we're going to get there. So, how to take these issues of sustainability from the hop growers and producers all the way to the brewers so that it's quantifiable, and the consumers respond to it, brewers respond to it. I mean, you can come up with lots of different ways, but it has to be meaningful. And like everybody here has been talking about, somebody has to buy that argument. Somebody has to buy that story, and to where it really, really matters. And one is cost reduction. That's important. That's an easy message. But in terms of we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that has to be an important story to everybody.
Stan, last question before we go to questions. I think I'm not sure if there's even an answer for it, but hearing those challenges with sustainability, in the product versus what consumers expect from the beer. How do we ensure that we're delivering hops that deliver the flavour, but also have that sustainable element to them? Is it better understanding the chemistry of hops that we started the chat talking about?
Well, if you're willing to wait 15 or 20 years, which we're going to have to wait a certain period, the understanding of the genome is advancing quickly. So you'll just be able to start with a great base towards sustainability. And this goes to certainly, I guess we were talking about irrigation among ourselves before we started. But if you worry about climate change, that's and how heat resistant the hops are, things like that. You think about the hops of the future. That's what breeders are working on right now, and both public and private programs. That if you can do that, you can go back to the same element, and you start like Sean Townsend, who's the breeder for Jim, is one of the leaders in understanding hop genomics. And as these things advance, you start with a great base, and then you talk about what consumers and what brewers want in terms of aroma and flavor. So down the road, there's good reason to take a positive view, I think.
Terrific. Does anybody have any questions? We've got an amazing panel. Does anybody have any questions? We can get a mic to you. Hands up. No one's got... Or no one, everyone's too shy to ask a question?
Need a little more coffee, huh?
Yeah.
Too early in the day, not enough beer.
Yeah, it's about time for beer for us here.
Yeah, it's
shy Australians. That's an oxymoron.
the pubs are open here, but I'm not sure. I think everyone's still got a coffee in their hand. So I guess it's before we let you go, does anyone do each of you have a final thing you'd like to say about what we're seeing in hop development or hop usage in beer? Jim.
No, I would only want to say to the group there that keep charging ahead and brewing great beer, keep the industry going, keep it interesting, bring more consumers into it, and use as many hops as you possibly can.
Alexandra?
It's twofold. Don't forget about public hop varieties because they're your friend. And write contracts, please. It'll help.
Terrific. And Tom?
The folks at Bintani are very sharp. They've got a good variety of different products, downstream products, as well as new products. Refer to them for technical advice. They can introduce new things to you that will be helpful, useful, innovative, and make you all better brewers.
And Stan?
I think the more time that brewers and hop growers spend together, the easier it is for them to make advances and understand what the other ones want. I realize that you might be a brewer in Australia and you say, how do I communicate with brewers in Germany? If you start by communicating with growers in Germany, growers in Australia, you at least begin to understand the hop. And every conversation a grower has with you as a brewer, they understand more about what you want as well.
That's great advice. Well, Jim, Alexandra, Stan, and Tom, thank you very much for giving us part of your afternoon as we kick off the Day of Education down here. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, have
a big round of applause.
A good day of learning.
Yes. Adios, everybody.
Adios.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.